Very warm welcome to all participants of today's AES Speaker event. I hope all of you are doing well and had a great Easter weekend despite the current challenges. My name is Mathias and I will be today's host. Having said that, I'm delighted to welcome today's guest speaker, Dr. Parag Khanna, live from Singapore. Good afternoon, Parag. Thanks for taking the time.
Hello, Mathias.
Before I properly introduce our guest, let me briefly say a few words about the Asian European Society Munich. We are a non-profit Munich-based student society that aims to foster the mutual understanding between students from Asia and Europe. Therefore, our team of around 30 people organize a broad range of events such as today's one. So to all Munich students out there, I highly encourage you to reach out to us in case you want to be part of this fun and diverse community. You can learn more about us by visiting our website, aesmuc.de, or by following our social media channels. That being said, for those of you who do not know Parag yet, I will say a few sentences about him. I hope you don't mind if I quickly read it out. So, based in Singapore, Dr. Parag Khanna is founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. What this exactly means, Parag, you can maybe tell us a bit more later. Further, Parag is not only author of various bestsellers such as The Future is Asian and Connectivity, but also frequent contributor to leading international media, including CNN, New York Times, and so on. Before starting FutureMap, Parag worked at leading research institutions and think tanks such as Brookings Institution and World Economic Forum, and has also been advisor to the US government. He holds a PhD from LSE, as well as degrees from Georgetown University. Born in India, the US citizen speaks 5 languages fluently and has traveled to more than 150 countries, which is indeed quite a lot. Before I hand over to Parag, let me finally elaborate on the structure of today's session. Parag will start off with a short keynote on today's question, why is the future Asian, for around 10 to 15 minutes maybe. And afterwards, we will go over to the Q&A part, where we start off with some own and pre-submitted questions. However, all of you guys are also highly encouraged to ask questions during the event by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will try to cover as many as possible given our time constraints. Again, Parag, thanks for being our guest today. We really appreciate it, and we are excited to hear your thoughts. Let me quickly share your slides.
Thank you very much, Mathias. It's great to be with you. Thank you for the invitation. Greetings to everyone, wherever you may be, Munich or otherwise. I'm presently in Singapore, and actually the TU Munich has a center here in Singapore that works together with the National University on the issue of smart cities. And they're doing some incredible research actually about climate modeling and looking at how to reduce the heat that is emitted from the economy of a city to cool it down and so forth. So there's already a strong connection between Munich and Singapore. So thank you all for joining. Despite the circumstances, and I just want to make a few opening comments about what I think is so interesting about the consequences for how we think about the world in light of the coronavirus. The first is that, for many people outside of Asia, looking at Asia, there is a bad habit of basically conflating Asia with China. Asia is whatever China wants. China is the most powerful country. The other countries are in decline or don't matter. But what we've seen, obviously, coming out of this crisis is that Asian democracies are being appreciated very significantly. So if you look at South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, these are the countries that have transparent governments, independent civil service institutions, high degree of trust in government, and an embrace of the latest technology and using it for the welfare of the citizens. And they've earned greater trust as a result of the way in which they've managed to, quote unquote, flatten the curve. So I wanted to go back to one of the ideas that I talk about in the Asia book, which I call the new Asian values. Back in the 1990s, this expression Asian values was actually identified with very paternalistic, Confucian, hierarchical, and quite frankly, corrupt economic practices. Today, I use the term differently, these three Asian values that one finds across the region. And here I don't just mean East Asia. I actually mean, in a fairly aspirational sense, some of the things that you can find either existing in practice or part of the agenda of many Asian countries, whether they are democratic or authoritarian, whether they're East Asian, South Asian, or Central Asian. So what are they? The first is what I call technocratic governance. And this means that, well, again, whether a country is a democracy or a non-democracy, it is a place where the executive branch has a long-term vision of modernization, but it's also complemented by a strong and independent civil service that is meritocratic. So what you find across Asia is that there is, again, as I mentioned, a high degree of trust in leaders. They aspire, obviously, to low corruption in the spirit of Japan and Singapore, for example. So technocratic governance is something that is, again, something that's quite prominent in the region. Voters want there to be an executive who has a long-term vision. The second is mixed capitalism. That means a strong role for the state in the economy. Not only a high share of GDP, but also a strong, degree of welfare provision and an ability to regulate or steer the economy in a way that supports critical industries and high growth sectors. So the whole idea of developing national champions, that's not something that Asians are opposed to. In Europe, there's a big debate about, even though European countries all have industrial policy, there's a big debate about just what role should there be in steering strategic industries and so forth. In America, it's been outright rejected until more recently, where the government has had no choice in the case of the post-financial crisis bailouts, and of course now the support that industry needs as a result of the virus. So mixed capitalism is the norm here. And the third is social conservatism, and here what I basically mean more is the idea of solidarity, social solidarity. Despite the fact that actually many Asian countries are very diverse, there is this willingness to accept, if not to subordinate, individual, I don't want to say individual rights, but individual desires for collective benefit when necessary. And you can see obviously how important that crucial factor has been, even though it seems very intangible, in the coronavirus response. Because when the experts said, please do stay home, please quarantine, please wear a mask, that's what the people did. Also, obviously, they have the experience of the SARS epidemic, but notwithstanding that, there is a sense that because leaders are trusted and because they exercise a great deal of caution, the precautionary principle, if you will, in everything from areas where we would criticize them for doing so, like press freedom, to areas where we increasingly see the value in what they're doing, like internet regulation, where you'll find that Western countries are looking quite seriously at Asian countries, not China, obviously, but other countries as a role model, where they say, you know what, fake news is not a good thing. Maybe we should have a strong degree of filtering mechanisms and legal consequences for disseminating fake news, because it can manipulate society and even elections. So Asia has had, in this regard, what I would call second mover advantage. First mover advantage in business is obviously when you're the first one in the market. But Asians have had a chance to watch the election of Trump and Brexit in 2016. They're able to say, look at how social media was poisoned and how it was hijacked to sway these political outcomes. We do not want that to happen in Asian countries. And therefore, they've crafted fairly strong regulations. And what you find now is that Western countries are saying we need to do something like that too. So this idea of social conservatism may seem very punitive. And indeed, I would never condone the degree of press censorship that exists in many Asian countries or restrictions on women's rights. I would never condone those things. But I am talking, again, more broadly about the idea of solidarity and the protection of the public good as something that is critical in times of crisis, or even in times of political and democratic debates. So that's just a rough sketch of these three new Asian values. They pre-exist and predate in many ways, this virus, right? They also predate the 2016, shift towards populism, but they are amplified now as a result of what's happening today. Let's just quickly go to the next slide. Thank you, Mathias. So this is a shift in gears. I want to emphasize here some of the big, one of the biggest things that I think is going to be a consequence of this pandemic is how we view migration. Now, I think this is very important because a lot of you, watching are very young, so you may not have thought about it, but what we just did, what the world is doing right now, this simultaneous standstill or lockdown, or almost coordinated simultaneous global standstill of billions of people, has absolutely never happened in human history. Nothing even close. So that includes migration. And of course, migration is this constantly unfolding process. And in the year 2018 or 2019, more than 1.5 billion people crossed borders, right? There are more than 300 million people who live outside of their country. Suddenly, everything has been reset. And what is so fascinating about it is not only that mankind has almost managed a simultaneous act, but also that means that starting this year or next year, we will get to witness this controlled experiment. What happens when the pandemic lifts, when borders start to soften again, and people are allowed to move again? We will watch this great experiment of the next phase of human migration. Where will people go? Where do they want to go? What are the red zones that they will leave? What are the green zones that they want to go to? What are the countries that have proven themselves capable of handling a crisis, and the societies that have failed? And what countries have tolerance for and need for more migrants, and which ones will continue to reject them? All of those questions will now be answered in real time over the next 2, 3, 5, 10 years. Now, the virus is not the only motivation, obviously, for migration. We have to think also about climate change. Starting a few years ago, the number of climate migrants in the world was actually larger than the number of political refugees. And if you think about climate change and its continued impact, even accelerating impact, that's why I would direct your attention to the map on the right. That shows you the predictions around what the geography of global food production would be if temperatures rise 3 degrees Celsius. So you'd find that most of the present largest food producers in the world, like Brazil or America, India, China, Australia, they will be desertified, right? They will suffer from terminal droughts, whereas much of the world's food would be grown in the higher latitudes of the northern hemisphere, and the combined population of all of those latitudes of the Arctic Circle is very, very low, very, very small. So it's a remarkable contrast, really, between where the world population is today, what you see on the left, and where our food supply will be, what you see on the right. Now, we don't all have to go live where our food is. That's not the point. The point is to say that things like climate change, food insecurity, obviously health security, unemployment and the cost of living, political crises, economic dislocation, labor automation, all of these forces have been accelerating the need and indeed the reality of greater migration. So we're adding another factor to that now, and I can imagine this experiment as it plays out really resorting the world population. Now imagine one other factor, digitization. Now you can study from anywhere. Everyone will have Zoom and WebEx now on their laptops. Sometimes you won't even be able to go to the country that you're studying in. So a lot of people will have more optionality in terms of where they live. So this is a second hypothesis that I think is worth, or just an area that I think is worth discussing. So I wanted to start just with those, those sort of propositions. There's one other point that I want to make, which is here about, of course, Europe and Asia, right? So, given the focus of your society, of your group, I have been, obsessed, I think would be a mild word, with Eurasia, as a subject of geographic and geopolitical study for a long time. And this is a map that I created a few years ago to look at some of the many planned and indeed completed infrastructure projects across Eurasia. Now, in this rectangle, there's 4.5 billion people, right? So the majority of the human population lives in this rectangle. And in Europe, you're just off to the west there. So it's really important to understand the internal dynamics of Asia through this infrastructure connectivity that really began 30 years ago with the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's what really enabled Asian countries to, sort of move beyond the Cold War and to start to develop stronger relations with each other, more economic complementarities, and so forth. And all of this has really flourished over the last 30 years. The Belt and Road Initiative that China launched about 5 years ago is just the latest contribution to that effort. When we talk about Belt and Road, it's a subset of the new Silk Roads. It's not the entirety of it. And so to me, the relationship between infrastructure and geopolitics is a very interesting one. Because these, the projection that many people have is that wherever China is building infrastructure, it's taking over countries, buying countries, entrapping these countries in debt. But what also happens is that countries actually use this infrastructure, some do, as a platform for growth, for economic diversification, for job creation, to attract foreign investment from other countries besides China, and to decrease their dependency on China over time. And I think that is the dynamic that is probably the next phase. We can see this playing out, for example, in the area of infrastructure finance, because ever since China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, Europe has launched its Asia Connectivity Initiative, India and Japan have launched their Connectivity Corridors Initiative. The United States, together with Australia and New Zealand, have launched something called a Blue Dot Network to certify the sustainability of infrastructure projects. So what you have is not a situation where China dictates everything. You have what I call the infrastructure arms race. And in fact, Europe is involved in it, America is involved in it. And what that infrastructure arms race means is that you'll have more players involved, and not necessarily the dominance of China, but potentially the dilution of China. And this is very counterintuitive, and it certainly runs against the conclusion that most people are drawing right now about China's rise. But let me just make a final point, because you are all students of Asia. If you think about the last 4,000 years of Asian history, and I do mean the full Asian landscape, not just Greater China, what you would see is that only one empire has really dominated much of the geography that you see on this map, and it was the Mongols, and that was 700 years ago. And the pattern that's playing out today, a lot of people almost refer to China and the Belt and Road Initiative as if it's an effort to recreate this Mongol empire. It certainly is an effort to resurrect the Silk Roads in China's interest. But I'll end on the following point, which is that the event that did the most, in a way, to rupture the Silk Roads and to dismember the Mongol Empire was the Black Death of the 14th century. And if what we're experiencing right now is our 21st century equivalent, fortunately not with 30 or 40 million people dying, I think we're quite lucky in that regard. But what it did do is to fracture those Silk Roads. And today, again, what we'll find is that the appetite for a high amount of Chinese debt, the appetite for projects that one doesn't necessarily need, the desire to project one's own sovereignty and independence is growing. And therefore, we will find that Eurasia will, sort of not fragment because it's coming together, but there'll be more centers of strength and of confidence at a sub-regional level. And that the multipolarity that has characterized Asia for most of its 4,000-year history is likely to be the scenario moving forward. So I'll just end on that note and look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Parag, for sharing your insights. So during our Q&A, we want to dive in a little bit deeper in some of the topics you've already mentioned, and also broaden up the discussion a little bit. So therefore, we prepared a structure for the Q&A. Let me quickly share my screen. You should be up. There you go. You should see it right now on your screen. So thanks, Parag, again for the keynote. So we will start a little bit about talking Asia as a regional system. We will put a spotlight on big players and sub-regions. And coming further, we will have a look at Asia's rise in the world and ask ourselves the question whether this is a zero-sum game for the world. And in the end, there will be also time for a quick speed Q&A and also some open questions we haven't answered yet. Let me start off on a different note, Parag. Born in India, US citizen, PhD in the UK, now living in Singapore. One could easily argue that you are the typical world citizen. What might be more surprising to some of our participants is that you actually have a close connection to Germany and that you're fluent in German. So back in 2012, you said in an interview that, I quote, "Germany is the most equitable, efficient, and educated society today." Maybe you can briefly elaborate on your connection to Germany in the beginning and how you came to that conclusion back then.
Sure. Well, you know, I do have a very long history with Germany, and my first visit to Germany was actually right upon the fall of the wall. So I think most of you were probably not born at that point, but I was 12 years old. And immediately we were living in New York at the time. And my parents decided that this would be a very monumental holiday. So we immediately got on a plane and we flew to Berlin. Well, to Frankfurt, and then we drove actually overnight to Berlin. So it was really a very memorable trip. And I have a photo somewhere of me sitting on top of the wall, most of it obviously still standing, immediately after November 9th, 1989. And I actually took a hammer and a chisel and I hacked away many, many, many pieces of the wall. And I took them all back to New York and handed them out to my 8th grade schoolmates. So I have, that was when my kind of love affair with Germany, and in a way my passion for geopolitics really began right then when I was 12 years old. And I then went to live in Germany as a high school exchange student. So I actually wrote my Abitur exam and everything. And then I came back for a year of university to the Freie Uni in Berlin. Then I've visited and lived in and out, of Europe several times. So when I lived in Geneva, I was visiting Germany a lot. Just 2 years ago, I was living in Berlin again with my family as the Weizsäcker Fellow of the Robert Bosch Academy. So I spent a semester in Berlin as well. So for most of my life, Germany has been one of the places that I think of as home. And I really do. It's to be honest, if I had to leave Asia because of rising sea levels or because of World War III, the first place I would probably go, I would imagine, might be to Germany, not necessarily to the U.S. So yes, it's it's a long history. And in terms of Germany's standing, sort of Standort Deutschland, for me, it's been something that I have been writing about for a long time. When I wrote my first book, which was called The Second World, Empires and Influence in the New Global Order, I was talking about Europe as an empire, and within that, looking at the very different models of capitalism and political economy. And I mentioned that, in Europe, in Western Europe in particular, with the welfare state and regulated capitalism, the average citizen has a certain security in their quality of life that the average American doesn't have. And what I said in that interview was also reflecting the fact that for that average German citizen, and remember that America is a very large country, 330 million people. So there are not many comparable societies where you could sort of really make what we call an apples to apples kind of comparison. So Germany and Japan are the next two large westernized industrial democratic countries. And what you would say, and even though again Germany's population is only 80 million, so much smaller, but the average German citizen does have, you could say objectively, if you could say so, a better quality of life in terms of access to public services, guaranteed education. If you look right now, obviously, at the wage protection that Germans have, due to the coronavirus, it's obviously far superior to what Americans are receiving. And the same is for Japanese people. So I made that point, several times in various, writings of mine, but I also think it's just sort of common sense analysis. And I think it's maybe just worth saying also because I think for Europeans, there is a general climate of pessimism, even though the European Union remains relatively popular among European youth as a default, and you've grown up with it. So it's not that you necessarily want to dismantle it, but there isn't necessarily the kind of appreciation for the European Union. And I think that both as someone who sort of, experienced the wall and did these Euro 2020 conferences when I was in gymnasium, school in Germany, and as a young person, sort of, that was a time period around the Maastricht Treaty and so forth, where it really mattered a lot to young people to wave the European Union flag. And today, since the day most of you were born, it's already been waving. And you don't remember the Deutschmark. But I remember, traveling around, Euro railing with different little plastic bags of currencies. So, to me, even though I'm not European in any way, shape, or form, and yet, to me, it's something that Europeans should appreciate more, even though I'm not much older than you. It's just that I think it's had such a profoundly positive impact that people don't appreciate enough today.
Thanks, Parag. To jump over a little bit to today's topic, Asia. So you said roughly 5 billion people are living in Asia, which is around 2/3 of the world population. Also, more than half of the global GDP comes from Asia. Still, however, Germany, for instance, the German Foreign Ministry had no separate department for Asia and Asia Pacific until May 2017. You talk a lot to political leaders, also in Brussels. Do you think there's a general lack of awareness and knowledge about Asia and Europe, both in society and political leadership? And what has Europe maybe not yet fully understand about the Asia of today?
Well, first, let me say it's a great question. Second, let me say there's a real irony to the situation that we're in terms of the state of knowledge about Asia and Europe. And the third is to say that it's changing. So let me get to the second point. The irony is the fact that obviously in the Western mind, it was European colonial powers that discovered Asia, right? Whether it's missionaries or whether it's traders or conquerors, right? Going back to the Portuguese and Spanish and Dutch empires. And of course, it was the German philologists who, in their romanticization of Asian culture, did a lot of work in translating Asian languages, Asian customs, religions, history, philosophy, into German, Dutch, and English so that they could become the foundation for Western knowledge and learning about Asia. So it's obviously so ironic then that the state of knowledge about Asia is so lacking today in European policymaking circles. And one finds that even in Britain, which is again ironic because so much of Asia was ruled by Britain. One finds it in France, in Germany, and I've had many, many dealings with the Auswärtiges Amt over years and years of dialogues. And every time I go there, I say I almost dread, the simplicity of the conversation, because either it's all about China or it's all about human rights, right? And on the human rights, on the China part, again, I've said that, most of Asia is not China. Most Asians live in democracies, not in China. And, those simple facts really have to, be drilled into European minds so that you appreciate the incredible scale of Asia today and the diversity of regimes. Now, the second point about human rights is well taken, obviously. And I applaud Europe for its, sort of consistency, at least in talking about and raising human rights issues around the world. But there's two things lacking there. The first is, A, what are you going to do about it? What do you actually do about it, right? Does Europe actually prohibit arms sales to certain countries? And the answer is yes for some and no for others, right? Do you provide the degree of technical assistance to improve standards of governance? The answer is yes in some cases, not in others. But I would like to see, quite frankly, a much more confident Europe. Europe is the standard bearer for human rights in terms of regions of the world. And I would like to see Europe be so much more confident if it wants to talk about human rights so much. But the second aspect where I'm left, very disappointed is a lack of appreciation in governance. And this is very important because human rights and democracy are very, very essential aspects of good governance, but they're also not enough. And I mentioned in the first slide the role of an independent civil service and these independent institutions. And in Asia, what you find is that not only is there an improvement there, but according to the World Bank itself, the governance capacity of Asian countries, even those that we think of as having a poor human rights record, is in fact improving. And that's a Western standard. It's a Western metric. It's Western studies, Western indicators are ranking Asians as improving in governance. And I have provided that data in the book in one of the tables that you can see very clearly. So again, this is not a matter of opinion whatsoever. Governance in Asia, the capacity to govern, the capacity to deliver welfare, whether in good times or bad times, is manifestly improving. And I don't see Europeans taking that on board. Mostly it's a critique of Modi or a critique of Duterte. And I share those criticisms, right? And most people do. However, the question ultimately is, are you analyzing the right thing? Are you looking at the trajectory, and are you doing anything about it? So I want to see Europe engage so much more because, as you see from that last map, Eurasia is the future, right? Not just Asia, but really Eurasia. And therefore, it's imperative that there be a much greater investment in sort of transcontinental understanding and integration.
Perfect. Thanks, Parag. We have quite some topics on the list, so let's move on. So you talked on the first slide a little bit about Asian values. You talk in your books about Asianization. This obviously also includes soft power and cultural aspects. So to what degree will it affect our generations in the decades to come? How big is the effect of, for instance, Parasite winning the Oscars, TikTok and K-pop spreading all across the globe, also millions of Asian students studying abroad?
It's a great question. So this is one of the things that I tried to, quantify in my research is to say, this Asianization phenomenon is happening, but culture is something that is often so intangible. Sort of like, lots more people watch Bollywood movies, so what? Lots of people are learning Chinese, so what? Can you quantify all of these things? So I tried to take the kind of verticals of what we would define as, culture. Where do Europeans and Americans go on travel and holidays? Are they increasingly picking Asia? Are they in fact learning Chinese or Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, Hindi? Are they taking Bollywood dance classes? How many Asians are winning Nobel Prizes or the Palme d'Or or Oscars? And I really did list all of these things as much as possible in my research in the book, just to make a point that if you look at this from a time series point of view, it's undeniable that there is this, accelerating Asianization of the global kind of mind. And that was a very interesting exercise. At this point, it becomes anecdotal again because it's, Parasite wins the Oscar and TikTok and this. At this point, we're just adding more to what is already becoming quite a thick layer of Asianization around the world. And I think that will most certainly continue. Now you have an Asian American who's just, made a big name for himself running for president of the United States, Andrew Yang. So I think that we will reach a point where we'll no longer treat, Asia sort of the other because there will be so much of Asia in us. And I make the point, in the book that that's not an aggressive thing. It's not a triumphalistic thing. The entire world has the West in it. And I spend a lot of time in the book talking about how Asians could never expunge Western history from Asian life, right? Whether it's parliamentary democracy, the systems of government, the languages that are spoken, the very idea of sovereignty, such as it is with the demarcation of borders, all of those are Western, part of the Western experience and history and imposition, if you were to be negative about it, on Asia. But you don't hear Asians saying, we want to stamp out the Western imprint on our past, right? In fact, Asian countries really fall into two varieties. Those that have absorbed the past and made the most of it and used it as a catapult to lift them further, which is what Singapore has done. And those countries that are still, backwards looking and mired in the past, and that's what Arab countries tend to be like to some degree, although some are obviously coming out of that. And so I think that, the West should not be afraid of Asia's rise. It is your principal export market. It is the source of talent and manpower. It adds to a certain degree of cultural fusion. One of the things I mentioned not in the book, but I've been noticing more recently as I check out Spotify, is that you have, in Germany, when I was listening to German rap when I was a kid, it was, quite monochrome. All of the rappers look like you, Mathias, right? Today you have Eritreans and Persians and Turks and even half Vietnamese and Chinese, dance artists and rappers in the German music scene. And I think that's so cool. And, for me, 25 years later, it's a huge difference from the Germany that I knew when I was a kid.
Thanks, Parag. So we talked a lot about soft factors now. Let's switch a little bit over to the hard facts. You also mentioned institutions and collaborations within the region. You argue that along with the integration into existing organizations such as United Nations and WTO, Asian nations also build up their ecosystem of their own ecosystems of supranational institutions. Can you maybe give us like a really brief overview and outline potential tensions between established and also newly founded institutions?
Right. So, first of all, when we talk about, global governance, we've tended to view it from the perspective of how other powers, rising powers, Asian powers, are adapting to existing Western institutions, right? For example, has India been granted a permanent seat on the UN Security Council? Do Asian countries have greater voting rights in the IMF or the World Bank? Rather than looking at things from the inside out point of view, what are Asians doing to govern themselves? And beneath the radar, that's actually what's been happening. So the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and so forth are examples that even if they borrow from the institutional design or the protocols or the codes or the laws of the World Trade Organization or the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank, they are still founded by and operated and run by and financed by Asian countries. So Asians have developed a much stronger capacity to regulate their own affairs. That does not mean that they have to become supranational like the European Union. It doesn't mean that they have to be, hard legal multilateralism. Asians will do things the Asians way. I think it's very difficult sometimes for people to relate to, again, scale. Asia is much, much bigger than Europe, both demographically and geographically. Diversity, there's no reason for 6 or 7 completely heterogeneous civilizations to fuse together under the umbrella of a European Union with a single flag. So we should never use a Western, template or teleology to apply to Asian circumstances. It's much more interesting to look at how Asians historically have dealt with each other despite their suspicions and diversity and come to accommodation rather than to pretend that there is one pathway forward for multilateralism. So Asians have found a way, for example, and this is obviously very important, over the last 30 years to, keep World War III at bay. We have expected Taiwan to be World War III, North Korea to be World War III, the China-Japan tensions, India-Pakistan, India-China, South China Sea. The list goes on of World War III scenarios in Asia. They could break out any time, but the fact that they have not yet is important. And we don't spend enough time asking ourselves, how is it that Asians have managed to keep the peace, even though they don't have such strong binding multilateral bodies in Asia? And there's cultural, institutional, diplomatic, historical answers to that have not been explored nearly enough, and they should be.
Thanks, Parag. So in the end of your answer, you kind of already answered the next question, which would have been a little bit on the concept of frenemies. You talk a little about that in your books, that Asian nations manage it quite well to be some kind of mixture between enemies and friends. So let me skip that one and come to real conflict. So there are quite a few ongoing and unsolved conflicts within the region: Kashmir conflict, territorial disputes in the East and South China Sea, North and South Korea, obviously, also Taiwan, just to name a few. So Parag, let me ask you, when you cannot sleep at night, which conflict or development worries you the most? Where do you actually see escalation potential in the next years?
You know, I've lived now in Asia for about 6 years or so, and you know, I don't have sleepless nights that I can recall, despite, you know, moving to a very vulnerable strategic zone. Because again, I think that we have not given Asian leaders enough credit. We look at them superficially as nationalistic, combative, pugnacious, you know, and so forth, territorial, and yet behind the scenes, they are very willing to compromise and to, you know, make attempts to settle disputes. Now, again, I've written a series of papers in the last couple of years, articles in journals, advocating that conflicts in Asia not just be managed, which is a very euphemistic way of saying pushed aside, but rather that they be settled. Can Asians make this the leap from managing conflicts to actually settling them and still preserve the domestic political credibility that leaders seek to sustain? And I believe it is possible at moments like this, when you have these very strong leaders, you know, in power. It's a question of the narrative. It's a question of the optics. It's a question of what the actual agreement is in matters like the South China Sea and boundary disputes that exist between countries. But I absolutely think it's possible, and very often, and we know this very well from any other part of the world, the reason sometimes things don't happen is not because there's a good reason, but because of inertia. And inertia means that you do something because that's what you've been doing, not because it's the right thing to do. It's just the force of habit. So I think we have to get out of that force of habit. And a crisis can be a good, you know, motivator for that. So I do think some of these disputes will just settle themselves over time. They will burn out, if you will. Others may have a violent resolution. There's no doubt about it. There could be a violent resolution to Taiwan. There could be a violent resolution to some of the disputes in the South China Sea. No question about it. But let's remember one thing, and this has nothing to do with Asia per se, but whether or not you end a dispute or settle a dispute violently, the fact is that it does at some point end. And when it does, you do move on beyond it, even if that settlement is unfair. Otherwise, you would not have the European Union today. The reason you have the European Union is because you had a half century almost of tragic wars. So the question is, can Asia have conflict settlement without the war? And I think that on paper, the solutions are actually relatively clear. I think just the effort is lacking to get there because, again, this is about inertia. Diplomats tend to have a fairly conservative bias when it comes to saving face. No one wants to be seen to make a proposal that is positive and constructive, but is then rejected as being naive and, you know, poorly timed, because then one will lose face. So I think that there is a different approach, an Asian approach, that needs to be taken in some of these areas. And I think that, you know, if you ask the question, why hasn't it happened? It's really just that Asia has been focused on other things. A lot of these disputes have not even considered important until the last few years, because actually Asian countries were largely focused on domestic national economic development and growth. And now some of these frictions are becoming apparent that had been dormant for a long time. So I think that the rising domestic confidence, but also the stakes being higher, the stakes of conflict being much higher, present an opportunity to also resolve these conflicts.
Great, thanks. Last question to the conflict. So when you talk about Asia, so many people in Europe would see in Asia, mostly East Asia. When you talk about Asia, you also include West Asia, what we would call the Middle East. So in 2007, you served as a senior geopolitical advisor to the US government in Iraq and Afghanistan. What some of our listeners might surprise is that actually China shares a common border with Afghanistan. Can you tell us maybe just very brief what East Asia thinks about the Middle East, whether there's collaboration or whether it's also seen as mostly a region of conflict?
Well, fortunately, Asians are better at geography than most people in the West today. So they call it West Asia as they should. I have an anecdote in the book where I talk about my grandfather, an Indian diplomat who had served in East Africa and traveled a lot in West Asia. And of course, for any Indian and for most Asians, the so-called Middle East, most of it is West Asia. Now, let me just make a geographical point. Geographers don't disagree about what Asia is. I do not have my own definition of Asia. The Asia of my maps, the Asia in my books, is the only correct definition of Asia, and it's not mine. It's the geographical definition of Asia. The problem has been, and one of the reasons I even bothered to write the book, is that for 20 years we've had books about Asia that were actually just about China, or just about Japan, or really just about America in its dealings with China and Japan, but not really about Asia and the Asian system. And in your slide about the questions and topics, you mentioned this word, so let me just make a point about that. A system, in international relations theory, has a very specific meaning. I hope some of you have studied international relations theory. I did, and maybe I could have studied something else, but I don't regret it. And in international relations theory, we use the word system in a very specific way, and it speaks to the intensity of relations between sets of countries. And Europe, obviously, is a system. Asia, we never talk about as a system, but Asia has become a system, even without robust multilateralism, because you can see through the economic and investment ties, strategic ties, and so forth, infrastructural ties. And this gets to your question about how East Asia sees West Asia, because increasingly you find that, of course, the largest trade partners for West Asian countries are East Asian countries because of the energy trade. The largest foreign investment that's coming into West Asian countries is increasingly from East Asian countries. You can see that students are now coming from West Asia to East Asia more and more, and so on and so on and so on. So over time, these new Silk Roads are coming back and resurrecting what I call the Arab-Asian Nexus. And I use that term because those of you who remember the famous book, The Clash of Civilizations by Samuel Huntington, he referred to what he called the Confucian-Islamic axis. And he wanted to put a religious spin, if you will, on relations across this geography. But I don't think that religion has anything to do with it, even though there are historical religious ties. Obviously, most obvious being the fact that Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. Really, you would call it a sort of axis of convenience more than anything else. And that's why I prefer to call it the Arab-Asian nexus. It's not religious, it's geographic, it's cultural, and it's most of all just commercial. So right now, East Asia sees West Asia as a troubled zone, but as a zone of opportunity, because obviously it's where a large amount of commodities come from, and it's a passageway to very important trade routes, to the Mediterranean Sea, and obviously to Europe.
Perfect, thanks. As time moves on, I would skip a couple of questions on China, but we had from 2 participants pre-submitted questions. One of them was, along with China's rise in the world, you can also witness a growing level of xenophobia, especially accelerated also due to the Chinese origin of the virus. Do you have any thoughts on how to deal with that? What are the key success criteria for peaceful rise of China? And vice versa, also, what does the world need to understand about China? Maybe a brief answer, if possible.
Well, a brief answer to a very big question. I've noticed in the last, few weeks, obviously, that a lot of people have been making commentary online about how China is trying to rewrite the narrative about the origin of the virus. It is trying to portray itself as a hero in helping countries combat the virus through its health Silk Road, provision of medical supplies, and therefore, the world may one day whitewash, the sort of Chinese origin of the virus. I find such commentary rather comical because, again, most of the world population lives in Asia. Therefore, most of the world population is very aware of where this virus came from. Most of the world population is not imbibing Chinese narratives and propaganda. They're not remotely interested in it. They would never believe it. And so I don't think that the world is going to forget, because most of the world is Asian, and most of the world therefore knows China much better than the people who are on Twitter, talking about China's good deeds, would suggest. So I think that backlash would be one way of putting it, but certainly the suspicion of China continues to rise. But again, this would not be the first instance. This is, at least 20 years worth of accumulated, grievances that countries have. Even when they cooperate with China, the suspicion is very, very high. And I think it's going to be that way, effectively forever, if I can even use that term. If there's one thing I can say very certainly, it's that, I can't think of any country where even when the cooperation with China is strong, the suspicion is also not very high. I don't think that anything that China can do can change that, quite frankly. I really don't. I don't even think that a change in the nature of the regime would change that. A change in the character of the regime certainly wouldn't be enough. Even a change in the nature of the regime wouldn't be enough, because it is still going to be a country that's going to act, in thoroughly nationalistic ways. And if it has a zero-sum approach towards trade, towards industrial policy, and above all else towards the environment, then that is going to have direct, tangible, negative consequences for Asian neighbors. And of course, they will blame China.
Thanks, Parag. Another big player in the region, obviously also India. We had another question on this. And so although India is still growing rapidly, however, it's obviously lagging behind China maybe 2 decades. So in this regard, one of our participants wanted to know, where do you see the underlying reasons for it? And what are the key success criteria for India's development in the decades to come?
So India, plays an increasingly pivotal role in maintaining that geopolitical equilibrium that I was talking about earlier, the need to have and maintain an Asian, or restore an Asian multipolarity based on that historical model of a balance, again, or equilibrium across Eurasia. So without India, it won't work. So India's rise as a major Asian power is a critical ingredient in that. India's cooperation with Japan and Australia and the United States in terms of the Quad agreements is also a critical ingredient in that. So I think that India has to stay the course of not only obviously having to focus a lot on its domestic concerns and priorities, China does as well, but a great power has to be able to meet its domestic obligations as well as continue with its international ambitions simultaneously. And that is something that India is now trying to do. And I think India has had a number of foreign policy successes. It's rebuilt strong ties with Russia. It has maintained some ties with Iran. Its ties with West Asian countries are very strong, obviously, given the demographics and economic linkages and energy markets. It's talking to Europe more about deepened trade, very strong relations with Japan, obviously good relations with the US, settling various disputes with Bangladesh. Obviously, the dispute with Pakistan is not resolved. But, one can see in a short period of time, this growing confidence that India has diplomatically. And again, I think it's very important for the overall multipolar landscape.
Thanks, Parag. So again, we skip a couple of questions on other regions such as Central Asia and Africa. Also, I can see that some participants asked question. We just make like one of the last pre-submitted questions. So back in 2008, you had a title story in the New York Times Magazine called Waving Goodbye to Hegemony. The question is a little bit about the leadership role of the US and how do you see it threatened in a multipolar world, like especially given increasing economic and rhetorical escalation between the US and China. Maybe you can also briefly explain, where do you see this conflict potential, military dominance in Asia, US military dominance?
Well, issues like this are evolutionary, not sort of singular. So when it comes to the idea of American hegemony and, where does one see, the threat? I mean, to be quite honest with you, the correct way to look at these things is not, again, as a matter of opinion or as an all or nothing proposition. We should quantify the role of a country, any country in the world. When it comes to the United States, You can look at its military positioning. Obviously, universal in terms of presence of U.S. forces in different parts of the world, but not necessarily equally compelling or influential. And again, as you noted, I served in Iraq and Afghanistan. I saw firsthand that having the most powerful military in the world doesn't guarantee that you will achieve your political outcomes, right? Not at all, no correlation. In Asia, is the US military presence deterring the Chinese activity? Well, not really. If you think about the South China Sea and many other areas, certainly in Taiwan it does, but not necessarily others. So it's a mixed picture. It's not a picture of total hegemony, right? Then you would look financially. So obviously the US share of global GDP has been steadily shrinking. The role of the US dollar remains very strong, but there is probably, there's different reasons why there could continue to be a shift away from the dollar in terms of trade, the denomination of trade in energy markets potentially, and because more countries trade with China and so forth. And currency reserves may diversify as well. A lot of countries are selling their US dollar reserves right now to raise capital for their domestic needs. There's technology. So, American technology companies, are obviously very powerful, very, very influential, very high quality in many areas, but the edge has eroded significantly because Japanese and Koreans and Taiwanese and Chinese now make their own semiconductors, they make their own mobile phones, hardware and software. The social media technologies and ecosystem are superior in China and other countries in Asia to the West, far superior, quite frankly. WeChat is a fundamentally better and more, user, sort of a more universal product than anything anywhere else in the world. So there's nothing to be learned at all from the West in that regard. So you would take these things issue by issue by issue. If you wanted to talk about the U.S. role, you wouldn't just say, oh, well, it's soft power is high this year, or it's low this year, or Trump got elected, therefore America is going to lose credibility. But if Joe Biden gets elected, then suddenly America will be number one again. That's not the way any serious scholar or student should ever look at these things. And by the way, I never use the term soft power other than to parody it as I was doing just now. I don't like the term at all because if it can't be measured, it doesn't really matter. Or it's far too volatile variable to be useful. So, I think the bottom line is in a multipolar world, America remains one of the poles, right? And it remains a very significant pole. And not only America, but North America is obviously the most geopolitically stable region and continent of the world, rich in resources and manpower and industry and technology and capital. So I don't actually worry about America remaining a pillar of global order. The question is simply, in different parts of the world at different times, in different ways, whether or not it's actually a dominant force or a more or less influential force, that's going to change. And the same goes for China. China can trade with a lot of countries, build infrastructure in a lot of countries, but one of the things that I study the most is to what extent you find that countries, even if they're weaker, even if they have asymmetric relationships with China, they are able to steer China, shape China, resist China, write their regulations so that China cannot buy into a substantial share of their economies and things like this.
Thanks, Parag. One thing is for sure, we need a second session. There are far more questions than time. However, quick end, just one sentence to a brief question. China without a CCP is?
China without the CCP
is? Can you hear me? Yeah. Just finish the question. It's just a quick.
Oh, China without the CCP is still a centrally governed unitary authoritarian state.
Okay.
It's still China without the CCP is still a techno-authoritarian state.
Okay, thanks. So we skipped the remaining ones because it's already 12 and I heard you have a call. So first and foremost, Parag, a big thank you to you for your time and being our guest today. In case you want to learn more about Parag's work, I can highly recommend his books, which are available on Amazon and also audible. Also, big thanks to all participants for joining today's event. This was the first one, so we are always eager to get some feedback from you guys, and sorry to all the participants whose questions we couldn't answer today, but there will be, as I said, more events, also China-specific events and events too on other regions in Asia. Yeah, that being said, take care of yourself and your loved ones. Parag, thanks again. We hope we welcome all of you soon again as participants in our AES speaker event. Thanks, Parag.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.